Jake Martinez pulled his old pickup truck into the gravel driveway of his lake cabin and immediately knew something was wrong. The front door that he always painted forest green was now bright yellow, with a cheerful welcome mat that read, "Collins, Family Retreat" in flowery letters. His grandfather's wooden rocking chair was gone from the porch and replaced with white plastic furniture that looked like it came from a discount store. Jake sat in his truck for a moment, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He had been away for 3 weeks working a consulting job in Denver, and this was supposed to be his quiet homecoming. The cabin sat on 12 acres of prime lakefront property that his grandfather had bought in 1952. Jake had spent every summer here as a child and inherited the place when his grandfather passed away 15 years ago. He walked up to the front door and tried his key, but it would not turn. Someone had changed the locks. Jake walked around to the back of the cabin and found that the spare key he kept under a fake rock was gone too. Through the kitchen window, he could see that someone had been living here. There were dishes in the sink and food on the counter. A woman's purse sat on his dining room table. Jake pulled out his phone and called the local sheriff's office. While he waited for them to arrive, he walked around his property to see what else had changed. Someone had planted flower beds where his grandfather's vegetable garden used to be. They had also installed a bird bath and several garden gnomes near the lake shore. His boat dock had been painted white and pink instead of the natural wood color he preferred. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's car pulled up and out stepped Deputy Kevin Hayes. Jake had met him a few times at the local diner and thought he seemed like a decent enough guy. Kevin was young and eager to help, but sometimes got in over his head with complicated situations. "What seems to be the problem here, Jake?" Kevin asked as he walked up. "Someone has been living in my cabin while I was away," Jake explained. "They changed the locks and moved in their own furniture. I have no idea who did this or why." Kevin nodded and walked around the cabin with Jake. He took notes and photos of the changes that had been made. Just as they finished their walk around the property, a silver SUV pulled into the driveway with music playing loudly from the speakers. Out of the SUV stepped a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive workout clothes. She carried herself like someone used to getting her way and looked annoyed to see Jake and Kevin standing on what she clearly considered her property. "Excuse me, but you are trespassing on private property," the woman announced in a loud voice. "I am Margaret Collins, and this is my family's retreat cabin. I need you to leave immediately, or I will call the police." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "Lady, this is my cabin. My grandfather bought this land in 1952, and I inherited it from him. You are the one who is trespassing." Margaret laughed and pulled a folder of papers from her SUV. "I think you are confused. This property belongs to the Sunset Lake Homeowners Association, and I am the president. Your grandfather never paid his HOA dues, and the property reverted to us years ago. I have all the legal paperwork right here." She handed the papers to Kevin, who looked through them with a confused expression. The documents looked official with stamps and signatures, but Jake could tell something was not right about them. "These papers say that all property within 5 miles of Sunset Lake is part of the HOA," Kevin said slowly. "Is that correct, Mrs. Collins?" "Absolutely," Margaret replied with confidence. "The HOA was established in 1955 and covers this entire area. Mr. Martinez's grandfather signed the original agreement but stopped paying his dues in 1987. We have been very patient, but now we need to use the property for the good of the community." Jake felt his temper rising but tried to stay calm. "I have never heard of any HOA, and my grandfather never mentioned anything like that. This lady is lying, and I want her arrested for breaking into my cabin." Margaret pulled out her phone and started recording. "Deputy Hayes, I want this man arrested for trespassing and making threats against me. He is clearly unstable and dangerous. I have been using this property legally for months, and he has no right to be here." Kevin looked back and forth between Jake and Margaret with an uncomfortable expression. He was clearly out of his depth and not sure what to do. The paperwork Margaret showed him looked legitimate, even though Jake's story made more sense. "Look, folks, why don't we all calm down and figure this out?" Kevin said. "Mrs. Collins, do you have proof that Mr. Martinez's grandfather agreed to join the HOA?" Margaret shuffled through her papers and pulled out what looked like a signed contract. "Right here, Deputy." Vernon Martinez signed this agreement in 1955 to join the Sunset Lake HOA. The signature is clear, and the document is notarized. Jake looked at the paper and shook his head. My grandfather's name was Victor, not Vernon. And this signature does not look like his handwriting at all. This is obviously a fake document. Are you calling me a liar? Margaret demanded. I am a respected member of this community and the elected president of our HOA. This man is clearly trying to steal property that belongs to all of us. Kevin studied the documents again and seemed to be leaning toward believing Margaret. She spoke with authority and had official-looking paperwork, while Jake only had his word and a key that no longer worked. Mrs. Collins, how long have you been using this cabin? Kevin asked. About 6 months, Margaret replied. The HOA board voted to turn it into a community retreat center. We have invested thousands of dollars in improvements and decorations. Mr. Martinez abandoned this property years ago. I was here just 3 weeks ago, Jake protested. I have been coming here regularly my whole life. This woman broke in and changed my locks. Margaret shook her head sadly. Deputy, I think this man might have mental health issues. He seems confused about basic facts and is becoming aggressive. I am genuinely concerned for my safety. Kevin made his decision. Mr. Martinez, I am going to have to ask you to leave the property while we sort this out. Mrs. Collins has documentation showing HOA ownership and you do not have a working key. Jake could not believe what he was hearing. You are going to take the word of this stranger over mine. This is my family's land. Sir, I need you to calm down and step away from the cabin, Kevin said in his official voice. We can discuss this more at the sheriff's office if needed. Margaret smiled triumphantly as Jake walked back to his truck feeling defeated and confused about how his peaceful homecoming had turned into such a nightmare. Jake sat in his truck at the end of his own driveway feeling angry and helpless. He watched through his rearview mirror as Margaret Collins walked around his cabin like she owned the place. She was talking on her phone and gesturing wildly while Deputy Kevin Hayes stood nearby looking uncomfortable. After 20 minutes, Kevin walked over to Jake's truck and tapped on the window. Jake rolled it down and waited to hear what the deputy had to say. Mr. Martinez, I talked to Mrs. Collins and she is willing to let this slide if you just leave quietly, Kevin said. She does not want to press charges, but she insists that you stay away from the property. Kevin, this is insane, Jake replied. That woman broke into my cabin and you are treating me like the criminal. I have been coming to this lake since I was 5 years old. Look, I understand you are upset, but she has legal documents and you do not, Kevin explained. The best thing you can do is get a lawyer and sort this out in court. Right now I have to go with what the paperwork says. Jake shook his head in frustration. Those documents are fake, Kevin. Anyone can see that. She said my grandfather's name was Vernon, but it was Victor. The signature does not match his handwriting either. I am not a handwriting expert, Mr. Martinez, Kevin said. That is something for the courts to decide. For now, you need to leave the area before this gets worse. Jake started his truck and drove away feeling like he was living in some kind of nightmare. He went to the local diner and ordered coffee while he tried to figure out what to do next. The waitress knew him and asked how his cabin was doing. When he told her what happened, she looked shocked. That Margaret Collins woman has been causing trouble all over the county, the waitress said. She claims her HOA has authority over properties that have been in families for generations. Most people just pay her fake fees because they do not want the hassle. Jake felt a spark of hope. So other people have had problems with her too. Oh yes, the waitress continued. She got old Pete Wilson to pay $5,000 in back dues for his fishing cabin. He was so scared of losing his property that he took out a loan to pay her. Then she demanded another $3,000 for improvements. Jake finished his coffee and drove to the county courthouse to research his property records. The clerk was helpful and pulled up all the documents related to his grandfather's land purchase in 1952. Everything was legitimate, and there was no mention of any HOA agreement or dues. Jake made copies of all the documents and drove back toward his cabin to confront Margaret again. When he arrived, he found that she had called more people to help her. There were 3 other cars in his driveway and several people moving furniture into his cabin. Jake parked and walked up to the group. Margaret saw him coming and immediately pulled out her phone. He is back, she announced loudly. The trespasser has returned and I feel threatened. Margaret, I have the property records from the courthouse, Jake said as calmly as he could. There is no HOA agreement and my grandfather never signed anything like that. You need to get out of my cabin right now. Margaret barely looked at the courthouse documents. Those are old records and they do not override the HOA authority. I am calling the sheriff again because you are harassing me. She dialed 911 and spoke in a panicked voice. This is Margaret Collins at the Sunset Lake Retreat Cabin. The dangerous man I told you about earlier has come back and he is making threats. I need police protection immediately. Jake could not believe she was lying so boldly. I have not made any threats, Margaret. I just want you to leave my property. He is getting aggressive again, Margaret said into the phone. Please hurry. Kevin Hayes arrived 15 minutes later, looking tired and annoyed. He had clearly hoped this situation was over, but now he had to deal with it again. Mr. Martinez, I thought I told you to stay away from this property, Kevin said. I went to the courthouse and got the property records, Jake explained. Look at these documents, Kevin. They prove that my grandfather bought this land legally and there was never any HOA involved. Kevin glanced at the courthouse papers, but Margaret quickly interrupted. Deputy, those old records do not matter, she said. The HOA supersedes individual property claims. We have legal authority over this entire area for the good of the community. Mrs. Collins showed me her HOA documents earlier, and they looked legitimate, Kevin said to Jake. I am not qualified to judge which papers are more valid. Margaret pulled out her phone again and showed Kevin several photos. Look at these pictures, Deputy. This man has been stalking me and my family. He took these photos of my children at the community pool last week. Jake stared at the phone screen in shock. The photos showed Margaret's children at a pool, but Jake had never seen them before in his life. Kevin, I have never taken photos of this woman's children. I do not even know who they are. The photos are right here on his phone, Margaret insisted. He must have sent them to himself to hide the evidence. Kevin looked confused and overwhelmed. He was dealing with accusations of stalking and harassment on top of the property dispute. Margaret seemed confident and had documentation, while Jake seemed increasingly desperate. Mr. Martinez, I am going to have to place you under arrest, Kevin announced. Mrs. Collins has provided evidence of stalking and you continue to trespass on property that she has legal claim to. Jake felt like the world was spinning out of control. Kevin, this is completely insane. I have never stalked anyone and this is my family's property. Sir, please turn around and put your hands behind your back, Kevin said as he pulled out his handcuffs. Jake had no choice but to comply. As Kevin read him his rights, Margaret stood nearby with a satisfied smile on her face. The other HOA members watched with approval as Jake was led to the sheriff's car. Deputy, make sure you search his truck for more evidence, Margaret called out. I am sure you will find additional proof of his criminal behavior. As the sheriff's car pulled away, Jake saw Margaret taking selfies in front of his cabin and posting them on social media. The caption read, Another victory for the Sunset Lake HOA. We do not tolerate troublemakers in our community. Jake spent that night in the county jail wondering how his life had turned upside down so quickly. He had one phone call and he knew exactly who to use it on. Lisa Martinez Chen was working late at her office in the federal courthouse when her phone rang. She recognized her father's number and answered immediately since he rarely called this late in the evening. Dad, what is wrong? She asked when she heard the stress in his voice. Lisa, I am in jail, Jake said quietly. Some woman took over my cabin and convinced the sheriff that I am a criminal. I need your help. Lisa felt her prosecutor instincts kick in immediately. Dad, slow down and tell me exactly what happened. Start from the beginning. Jake explained the entire situation from finding Margaret Collins in his cabin to being arrested for stalking and trespassing. Lisa took notes and asked detailed questions about the documents Margaret had shown Deputy Hayes. Dad, this sounds like fraud, Lisa said when he finished his story. I am going to make some calls and get you out of there tonight. Then we are going to figure out exactly who this Margaret Collins person is. Lisa hung up and immediately called the sheriff's office. She identified herself as a federal prosecutor and demanded to speak with whoever was in charge of her father's case. The desk sergeant was reluctant to discuss details, but Lisa's official title got his attention quickly. "Sergeant, I need to see all the documents that were used to arrest my father," Lisa said firmly. "This appears to be a case of fraudulent legal documents and false imprisonment." Within an hour, Lisa was at the sheriff's office reviewing Margaret's HOA paperwork. Her legal training immediately spotted problems with the documents. The notary stamps looked fake, and the legal language was full of errors that no real lawyer would make. "These documents are completely fraudulent," Lisa told the desk sergeant. "My father is being held based on forged papers. I want him released immediately." The sergeant called Deputy Hayes at home and woke him up to discuss the situation. Kevin was not happy to be dragged back into the mess, but he agreed to meet Lisa at the station. When Kevin arrived, he looked tired and frustrated. "Ms. Martinez, your father was very aggressive, and Mrs. Collins felt threatened. She had legal documents showing HOA authority over the property." Lisa spread the fake documents on the desk and pointed out the problems. "Deputy, these papers are full of legal errors and the signatures are obviously forged. Mrs. Collins is running some kind of scam and you arrested an innocent man." Kevin studied the documents more carefully this time. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the sheriff's office, the flaws were more obvious than they had been outdoors at the cabin. "I am not a lawyer," Kevin admitted. "The papers looked official to me and Mrs. Collins seemed very credible." "Deputy, my father has been visiting that cabin for 50 years, Lisa explained. "I have childhood photos of myself playing on that dock. This woman showed up 6 months ago and convinced you she owned the place." Lisa pulled out her laptop and began researching Margaret Collins online. What she found made her increasingly angry. Margaret had been involved in several HOA disputes across 3 different counties. In each case, she claimed legal authority over properties and demanded payment of fake fees. "Look at this, Deputy," Lisa said as she turned her laptop screen toward Kevin. "Margaret Collins has been running this scam for years. She targets elderly property owners and veterans who do not have the resources to fight back." Kevin looked at the screen and saw news articles about Margaret's previous schemes. One story described how she had convinced an elderly couple to pay $10,000 in fake HOA fees or lose their home of 40 years. "Why has nobody stopped her?" Kevin asked. "Because she picks victims who are afraid to fight back," Lisa explained. "She probably thought my father would be another easy target. She did not count on him having a daughter who is a federal prosecutor." Lisa called the courthouse security and had them open the records office even though it was past midnight. She and Kevin drove there together to examine the complete history of Jake's property. The record showed a clear chain of ownership going back to 1952 with no gaps or problems. "Deputy, there is something else you need to know," Lisa said as she read through the old land records. "My grandfather's property was not just a regular purchase. He bought it through a special government program for veterans. This land has federal protections that override any local HOA claims." Kevin looked confused. "What kind of federal protections?" Lisa pulled out a document marked with official government seals. The land was sold to veterans at below market price in exchange for certain agreements. Any attempt to seize this property illegally is a federal crime. She took photos of all the relevant documents and sent them to her colleagues at the federal prosecutor's office. Even at 2 a.m, she knew people who would take her calls. "Deputy, I am recommending that you release my father immediately and open an investigation into Margaret Collins," Lisa said. "What she has done is not just fraud. It is a violation of federal law." Kevin agreed to release Jake, but he looked worried about the implications of the case. "Ms. Martinez, what happens if I made a mistake arresting your father?" "You were deceived by a professional con artist," Lisa replied. "The important thing now is to make sure Margaret Collins does not hurt anyone else." Jake was released from jail at 3 a.m, looking tired but relieved to see his daughter. Lisa drove him to a hotel since his cabin was still occupied by Margaret and her accomplices. "Dad, I need you to tell me everything you remember about grandfather's purchase of that land," Lisa said as they sat in the hotel lobby. "There might be more to this story than we realize." Jake thought for a moment. "Grandfather always said the government gave him a special deal because of his service in World War II. He never talked about the details, but he was very proud of owning that land." Lisa nodded and made more notes. "Dad, I think Margaret Collins picked the wrong family to mess with. Tomorrow I am going to start an investigation that will shut down her operation permanently. She called her supervisor at the federal prosecutor's office and left a detailed message about the case. Lisa also sent emails to the FBI and the state attorney general's office requesting their assistance. What happens next? Jake asked. Tomorrow, we take back your cabin and make sure Margaret Collins never hurts another family, Lisa replied. She thought she was dealing with a helpless old man, but she just committed federal crimes against a prosecutor's father. Jake smiled for the first time since the nightmare began. Your grandfather would be proud of you, Lisa. He always said the Martinez family does not back down from bullies. Lisa looked at her father with determination. Margaret Collins is about to learn that lesson the hard way. The next morning, Lisa Martinez Chen walked into the office of State Attorney General Patricia Williams, carrying a thick folder of documents and a grim expression. Patricia had been Lisa's mentor when she first started as a prosecutor, and the two women had worked together on several high-profile cases. Patricia, I need your help with something that started as a simple property dispute, but has turned into something much bigger, Lisa said as she sat down across from the Attorney General's desk. Patricia poured 2 cups of coffee and settled in to listen. She had learned to pay attention when Lisa brought her cases because the young prosecutor had excellent instincts for spotting corruption. Lisa explained the entire situation with Margaret Collins and her fake HOA scheme. She showed Patricia the forged documents and the research she had done on Margaret's previous victims across multiple counties. This woman has been running this scam for at least 5 years, Lisa said. She targets elderly property owners and veterans who do not have the resources to fight back. My father just happened to be the wrong target. Patricia studied the fake documents carefully. Her office had been investigating fraudulent HOA practices statewide, and Margaret's name had come up in several reports. Lisa, we have been tracking someone matching this description for months, Patricia said. We have complaints from victims in 6 different counties, but nobody has been able to gather enough evidence to prosecute. She pulled out a file cabinet and retrieved a thick folder labeled HOA Fraud Investigation. Inside were dozens of complaints from property owners who had been victimized by fake HOA schemes. Look at this pattern, Patricia said as she spread the complaints across her desk. Someone claiming to represent various HOAs demands back dues from property owners. When people refuse to pay, they are threatened with legal action or property seizure. Lisa studied the complaints and saw that many of them involved the same tactics Margaret had used against her father: fake legal documents, intimidation, and exploitation of people who could not afford to fight back. Patricia, this is not just fraud, Lisa said. Margaret is specifically targeting protected classes. Look at the victims. Elderly people, veterans, minorities, and people living in rural areas who do not have easy access to legal help. Patricia nodded grimly. We think this operation has stolen over $2 million from victims across the state. The problem is that most people are too embarrassed or scared to come forward. She picked up her phone and called FBI agent Carlos Rodriguez, who had been working with her office on financial crimes. Carlos agreed to meet them that afternoon to discuss federal involvement in the case. Lisa, there is something else you need to know, Patricia said after she hung up. We think Margaret Collins is not working alone. We have evidence that she is coordinating with corrupt local officials to make her schemes more convincing. She showed Lisa surveillance photos of Margaret meeting with various county clerks and sheriff's deputies across the state. In each photo, Margaret was handing over envelopes that probably contained money. She bribes local officials to back up her fake documents, Patricia explained. That is why Deputy Hayes believed her story so easily. She probably has someone in his department on her payroll. Lisa felt sick thinking about how many innocent people had been victimized by this network of corruption. Patricia, what can we do to stop this? Your father's case is the break we have been waiting for, Patricia replied. He is not an easy target like her usual victims. He has family connections in law enforcement and his property has special federal protections. Agent Rodriguez arrived that afternoon carrying his own thick file on Margaret Collins and her associates. He had been investigating the group for federal mail fraud and racketeering charges. Ms. Martinez, your father stumbled into the middle of a major federal investigation, Carlos said. We have been tracking this organization for 8 months, but we needed someone to file a complaint who could not be intimidated. He showed them wiretap transcripts of Margaret discussing her scheme with accomplices. The conversations revealed a sophisticated operation that had victimized hundreds of property owners across multiple states. Margaret Collins is not her real name, Carlos continued. Her actual name is Margaret Simpson, and she has previous convictions for fraud in 3 other states. She came to this area 2 years ago and started building her network of corrupt officials. Lisa studied the wiretap transcripts and saw references to her father's property. Margaret had been planning to target the lake cabin for months and had researched Jake's background to identify potential weaknesses. She thought your father would be an easy mark because he lives alone and travels for work, Carlos explained. She did not know he had a daughter who is a federal prosecutor. Patricia leaned forward with interest. Carlos, what kind of federal charges are we looking at? Mail fraud, wire fraud, racketeering, civil rights violations, and impersonating. Federal officials, Carlos replied. If we can prove she was targeting veterans specifically, we can add hate crime charges. He pulled out a map showing all the properties Margaret had targeted across the region. The pattern clearly showed that she focused on rural areas where victims would have limited access to legal help. The other problem is that she has been forging federal documents, Carlos continued. Some of the fake HOA papers she creates include false government seals and signatures. That is a separate federal crime. Lisa looked at the scope of the investigation and realized that her father's case was just one small part of a massive criminal enterprise. How many other families has she destroyed? We estimate over 300 victims so far, Patricia replied. Most of them paid the fake fees rather than risk losing their homes. The elderly victims were especially vulnerable because they could not afford lawyers. Carlos showed them financial records that the FBI had obtained through court orders. Margaret and her accomplices had stolen millions of dollars and used the money to buy expensive cars, jewelry, and vacation homes. She has been living like a queen while destroying innocent families, Carlos said angrily. Your father's arrest was actually a gift because it gives us probable cause to move against the entire network. Patricia stood up and walked to the window, overlooking the state capitol building. Lisa, I want to make this case an example that will stop HOA fraud statewide. We are going to use every resource available to destroy this organization. She turned back to Lisa and Carlos with a determined expression. How quickly can we move against Margaret and her accomplices? We can arrest her tomorrow, Carlos replied. We have enough evidence for federal charges, and the wiretaps have given us probable cause for search warrants. Lisa smiled for the first time since the nightmare began. Margaret Collins picked the wrong family to mess with. She is about to learn what happens when you attack a federal prosecutor's father. Patricia picked up her phone to start making calls. Carlos, I want Margaret Collins and every one of her accomplices arrested simultaneously. This operation ends tomorrow. At 6 in the morning, FBI agent Carlos Rodriguez led a team of federal agents up the driveway to Jake Martinez's lake cabin. They found Margaret Collins sitting on the porch drinking coffee and scrolling through her phone like she owned the place. Margaret Simpson, you are under arrest for federal fraud charges, Carlos announced as agents surrounded the cabin. Margaret looked shocked to hear her real name. I think you have the wrong person. My name is Margaret Collins and I am the president of the Sunset Lake HOA. Ma'am, we know exactly who you are, Carlos replied as he showed her an arrest warrant. You have the right to remain silent. As agents searched the cabin, they found boxes of fake documents, official-looking seals, and a laptop computer containing detailed records of Margaret's victims. Her operation was much more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Agent Sarah Mitchell found a hidden safe in the bedroom containing over $50,000 in cash and a collection of fake identification cards. Margaret had been using multiple names and identities to avoid detection across different counties. Carlos, look at this, Agent Mitchell called from the kitchen. She had found a detailed map of the county with properties marked in different colors. Red marks indicated completed targets while green marks showed future victims. Carlos studied the map and counted over 200 marked properties. Margaret had been planning to expand her operation significantly, and Jake's cabin was just the beginning of a much larger scheme. Margaret, how many families have you stolen from? Carlos asked as agents continued searching the cabin. I do not know what you are talking about, Margaret replied. I am a legitimate HOA president and everything I have done is legal. Agent Mitchell brought over a laptop computer that contained thousands of emails between Margaret and her accomplices. The communications showed detailed planning for fraud operations across multiple states. Ma'am, these emails show you coordinating with corrupt officials to forge documents and intimidate property owners, Agent Mitchell said. This is not a legitimate HOA operation. One email chain revealed that Margaret had been paying Deputy Kevin Hayes $500 per month to support her fake claims. She had similar arrangements with county clerks, notaries, and even some judges across the region. Carlos called State Attorney General Patricia Williams to report what they had found. Patricia, this operation is bigger than we thought. Margaret has been coordinating with corrupt officials in at least 8 counties. Carlos, I want every one of those officials arrested today, Patricia replied. We are going to clean up this entire network. While agents continued searching the cabin, Margaret's phone rang constantly. Her accomplices were trying to warn her that FBI raids were happening simultaneously across the state. By noon, over 20 people had been arrested in connection with the fraud scheme. Agent Mitchell found Margaret's detailed financial records hidden in a false bottom drawer. The documents showed that the operation had stolen over $3 million from victims, and Margaret had kept detailed records of every transaction. Look at this, Carlos, Agent Mitchell said as she showed him a spreadsheet. She has been tracking every victim, including their names, addresses, and how much money she stole from each family. Carlos studied the spreadsheet and felt sick reading the details. One elderly couple had paid Margaret $15,000 in fake fees to avoid losing their family farm. A disabled veteran had given her his entire savings of $8,000. Margaret, these records show you specifically targeted vulnerable people, Carlos said. Elderly victims, disabled veterans, and families who could not afford legal help. Those people owed legitimate HOA fees, Margaret replied stubbornly. I was just collecting what was legally due. Agent Mitchell brought over a box of fake official seals and document stamps that Margaret had been using to create fraudulent paperwork. Some of the seals were very convincing copies of government agencies and legal offices. Ma'am, creating fake government documents is a federal crime, Agent Mitchell explained. These seals are almost perfect copies of official agencies. Carlos found evidence that Margaret had been selling her fraud methods to other criminal groups. She had created instruction manuals explaining how to target property owners and corrupt local officials. Margaret, you have been teaching other people how to run these scams, Carlos said. That makes you responsible for fraud operations in other states too. The most damaging evidence was a recorded phone conversation between Margaret and County Clerk Helen Murphy discussing how to forge property records. The recording clearly showed both women planning to steal Jake's cabin using fake documents. Listen to this, Patricia, Carlos said as he called the Attorney General. He played the recording over the phone and heard Patricia gasp in shock. Carlos, that recording proves conspiracy to commit federal crimes, Patricia said. I want Helen Murphy arrested immediately. By evening, the FBI had arrested Margaret's entire network of accomplices. The investigation revealed corruption in county offices across the state and exposed a system that had been victimizing innocent families for years. Agent Mitchell found Margaret's personal diary that contained detailed descriptions of her victims and how much she enjoyed destroying their lives. One entry described an elderly man who cried when forced to pay fake HOA fees to keep his family home. Margaret, this diary shows you knew these people were innocent, Agent Mitchell said. You enjoyed hurting them. I was providing a valuable service to the community, Margaret replied without any remorse. Those properties needed proper management. Carlos compiled all the evidence and prepared a report for federal prosecutors. The case against Margaret was overwhelming and included documentary evidence, recorded conversations, and testimony from dozens of victims. Patricia, we have enough evidence to put Margaret Simpson away for decades, Carlos reported. The corruption network she built is completely destroyed. Meanwhile, Jake Martinez stood outside his cabin watching FBI agents remove boxes of evidence. Deputy Kevin Hayes had been arrested that morning and charged with corruption and conspiracy. Dad, justice is finally being served, Lisa said as she put her arm around her father's shoulders. Jake looked at his cabin that had been violated by Margaret's greed and felt a mix of anger and relief. Your grandfather always said that criminals eventually get what they deserve. Agent Carlos approached them with a satisfied expression. Mr. Martinez, your cabin has been cleared, and you can move back in tomorrow. Margaret Simpson will never hurt another family. Lisa smiled as she watched Margaret being loaded into a federal transport vehicle. Dad, Margaret thought she was targeting a helpless old man, but she just destroyed her entire criminal empire. Jake nodded and looked at his cabin that would soon be his peaceful retreat again. Lisa, your grandfather would be proud of how you fought for our family. 3 days after Margaret Simpson's arrest, State Attorney General Patricia Williams stood behind a podium at the state capitol, surrounded by FBI agents and federal prosecutors. News crews from across the region had gathered to hear about the massive fraud investigation that had shocked the entire state. Today I am announcing the arrest of Margaret Simpson and 23 accomplices in connection with a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme targeting property owners across 8 counties. Patricia began. This criminal organization specifically targeted elderly residents, veterans, and minorities, using fake homeowner association claims. She held up examples of the forged documents that Margaret had used to intimidate victims. The fake papers looked convincing but contained numerous legal errors that had been spotted by federal investigators. The defendant created fraudulent legal documents and bribed local officials to support her schemes, Patricia continued. She stole over $3 million from innocent families and caused immeasurable emotional damage to her victims. Lisa Martinez Chen stood near the back of the room watching as her father's case became the centerpiece of a major justice initiative. Jake sat in the front row looking proud of his daughter and relieved that the nightmare was finally over. This investigation began when Margaret Simpson made the mistake of targeting retired Navy engineer Jake Martinez, Patricia said. Mr. Martinez refused to be intimidated, and his daughter, federal prosecutor Lisa Martinez Chen, helped expose the entire criminal network. The reporters asked detailed questions about how the fraud scheme worked and how many victims had been identified. Patricia explained that Margaret had been operating for over 5 years and had perfected a system of targeting vulnerable property owners. The defendant would research elderly or isolated property owners and then claim their land was subject to homeowner association fees, Patricia said. When victims refused to pay, she would forge legal documents and bribe local officials to support her claims. Agent Carlos Rodriguez explained the federal charges that Margaret was facing. The list included mail fraud, wire fraud, racketeering, civil rights violations, and impersonating federal officials. Margaret Simpson faces a potential sentence of over 30 years in federal prison, Carlos announced. She will also be required to pay full restitution to all victims of her schemes. Patricia held up a thick folder containing victim impact statements from families who had been destroyed by Margaret's fraud. Many of the statements described elderly people who had lost their life savings or been forced to sell family property to pay fake fees. One victim was an 80-year-old veteran who paid Margaret $15,000 in fake HOA fees to avoid losing the farm where he had lived for 50 years. Patricia read from the statements. Another victim was a disabled woman who gave Margaret her entire disability settlement to keep her home. The news conference also revealed that Margaret had been using multiple identities and had previous fraud convictions in other states. She had come to the region specifically to target rural property owners who would have limited access to legal help. Margaret Simpson is a career criminal who has spent her life victimizing innocent people, Patricia said. She chose her victims carefully and showed no remorse for the families she destroyed. Jake Martinez was invited to speak about his experience and how the fraud had affected his family. He walked to the podium looking nervous, but determined to help other victims. Margaret Simpson thought she could steal my family's land because I am an older man living alone, Jake said. She did not expect me to have a daughter who would fight back, but most of her victims did not have that kind of help. He described finding Margaret living in his cabin and how she had convinced Deputy Kevin Hayes to arrest him on his own property. The story shocked many of the reporters who had not heard the complete details. I spent a night in jail for trying to enter my own cabin, Jake continued. Margaret had forged documents claiming my grandfather never owned the land legally. She was very convincing, and I almost believed her myself. Lisa stepped up to the podium next and explained how federal prosecutors had built the case against Margaret and her accomplices. She emphasized that the investigation had revealed corruption in local government offices across multiple counties. This case shows what happens when criminals think they can prey on vulnerable people without consequences, Lisa said. Margaret Simpson picked the wrong family to target, and now her entire criminal organization has been destroyed. Patricia announced that Margaret had been denied bail because she was considered a flight risk and a danger to the community. She was being held in federal custody pending trial and faced the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison. The defendant has shown no remorse for her crimes and continues to claim that her actions were legitimate, Patricia said. She poses an ongoing threat to property owners throughout the region. The news conference also revealed that several corrupt local officials had been arrested, including Deputy Kevin Hayes and County Clerk Helen Murphy. Both had been receiving monthly payments from Margaret in exchange for supporting her fake legal claims. "We will not tolerate corruption in our local government offices," Patricia declared. "Every official who participated in this scheme will face federal charges." Agent Carlos announced that the FBI was continuing to investigate similar fraud schemes in other states. They believed Margaret's operation was part of a larger network of criminals targeting property owners across the country. "We encourage anyone who has been contacted by fake HOA representatives to report it to federal authorities immediately," Carlos said. "These criminals are sophisticated, and their documents can be very convincing." The news conference ended with Patricia promising that the state would implement new protections for property owners to prevent similar fraud schemes in the future. She also announced a victim compensation fund to help families recover money stolen by Margaret's organization. Jake and Lisa left the Capitol building feeling vindicated and proud of the justice system's response. What had started as a simple property dispute had become a major victory against organized crime. Dad, Margaret thought she was dealing with a helpless old man, Lisa said as they walked to their car. Instead, she exposed her entire criminal network and destroyed her own operation. Jake looked back at the Capitol building where reporters were still discussing the case. "Lisa, your grandfather always said that bullies eventually meet someone stronger than they are. Margaret Simpson just learned that lesson." That evening, Margaret sat in her federal holding cell, watching news coverage of her arrest on the television. For the first time since her capture, she began to understand the magnitude of her situation and the powerful enemies she had made. Her public defender had already told her that the evidence against her was overwhelming and that she should consider pleading guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. Margaret was finally beginning to realize that her criminal career was over. 6 months later, the federal courthouse was packed with reporters, victims, and legal observers. As Margaret Simpson's trial began, she had refused all plea bargain offers and insisted on fighting the charges despite overwhelming evidence against her. Federal prosecutor James Bradley opened the case by showing the jury security footage of Margaret breaking into Jake Martinez's cabin and changing the locks. The video clearly showed her moving furniture and personal belongings as if she owned the property. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will see evidence that the defendant, Margaret Simpson, operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that stole over $3 million from innocent families," Bradley announced. She specifically targeted elderly victims, veterans, and minorities who could not afford to fight back. Margaret's defense attorney tried to argue that she genuinely believed she had legal authority over the properties, but the evidence against her was too strong. The fake documents, bribed officials, and recorded conversations made her guilt obvious to everyone in the courtroom. Jake Martinez was the first witness called to testify. He described returning from his consulting job to find Margaret living in his family's cabin as if she owned it. His testimony was calm and detailed as he explained how she had convinced Deputy Kevin Hayes to arrest him. "I could not believe that someone could just take over my family's property and convince the police that I was the criminal," Jake testified. "Margaret Simpson destroyed my sense of security in my own home." Lisa Martinez-Chen testified next about discovering the fake legal documents and realizing that Margaret was running a sophisticated fraud scheme. She explained how federal investigators had uncovered evidence of corruption in local government offices. Margaret Simpson did not just steal money from victims, Lisa testified. She corrupted our entire system of local government by bribing officials to support her fraudulent claims. The prosecution presented dozens of victim impact statements from families who had been destroyed by Margaret's schemes. Many of the victims were elderly people who had lost their life savings or been forced to sell family property to pay fake HOA fees. One particularly emotional testimony came from veteran Robert Davis, who had paid Margaret $12,000 to avoid losing his family farm. Robert broke down crying as he described how Margaret had threatened to have him arrested if he did not pay the fake fees. She told me that I would lose everything my family had worked for if I did not pay the HOA dues, Robert testified. I used my entire disability settlement because I was afraid of becoming homeless. Agent Carlos Rodriguez testified about the FBI investigation and the evidence they had found in Margaret's cabin. He showed the jury her detailed records of victims and the spreadsheets tracking how much money she had stolen from each family. The defendant kept meticulous records of her crimes, Carlos testified. She tracked every victim and every dollar stolen. This was not a mistake or misunderstanding. It was a calculated criminal enterprise. The most damaging evidence was the recorded phone conversations between Margaret and her accomplices. The jury heard her discussing how to forge documents and intimidate victims who refused to pay fake fees. In one recording, Margaret could be heard laughing about an elderly woman who had cried when forced to pay $5,000 in fake HOA dues. The jury looked disgusted as they listened to Margaret's callous attitude toward her victims. "These old people are so easy to scare," Margaret said in the recording. "They will pay anything to avoid losing their homes." Margaret's defense attorney tried to argue that she had been misled by corrupt local officials, but the evidence showed that she was the one paying bribes and organizing the corruption. Her own emails and phone records proved that she was the leader of the criminal organization. Deputy Kevin Hayes testified against Margaret in exchange for a reduced sentence. He admitted taking monthly payments from her and explained how she had convinced him to support her fake legal claims. "Margaret told me that she was helping clean up problem properties in the community," Kevin testified. "She paid me $500 per month and I never questioned her documentation." County Clerk Helen Murphy also testified against Margaret and described how she had been pressured to forge property records and notarize fake documents. Helen admitted that she had known the documents were fraudulent, but was afraid to refuse Margaret's demands. "Margaret threatened to have me fired if I did not cooperate with her schemes," Helen testified. "She said she had connections with powerful people who could destroy my career." The prosecution presented financial evidence showing that Margaret had used stolen money to buy expensive cars, jewelry, and vacation homes. She had been living luxuriously while her victims struggled to recover from her fraud. Margaret finally took the stand in her own defense and claimed that she genuinely believed she had legal authority over the properties. Her testimony was unconvincing and contradicted by mountains of evidence showing her criminal intent. "I was trying to help the community by managing neglected properties," Margaret testified. "I never intended to hurt anyone." Prosecutor Bradley destroyed Margaret's credibility during cross-examination by showing her own emails discussing how to target vulnerable victims and avoid detection by law enforcement. "Ms. Simpson, did you write this email discussing how elderly victims are easier to intimidate than younger property owners?" Bradley asked. "I do not remember writing that email," Margaret replied weakly. "Ms. Simpson, this email was sent from your computer and contains your digital signature," Bradley continued. "Are you saying someone else had access to your personal computer?" Margaret could not explain away the evidence, and her testimony only made her look more guilty. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge William Carter sentenced Margaret to 15 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to all victims. He described her crimes as particularly heinous because she had targeted vulnerable members of society. "Ms. Simpson, you operated a criminal enterprise that specifically preyed on elderly citizens, veterans, and minorities," Judge Carter said. "You showed no remorse for the families you destroyed and continued lying even during your trial." Margaret was also banned from ever serving in any HOA capacity and prohibited from owning property in the state. Her assets were seized to pay restitution to victims, and she would spend the next 15 years in federal prison. Jake Martinez sat in the courtroom watching as Margaret was led away in handcuffs. He felt relieved that justice had been served, but sad about all the families who had been hurt by her schemes. "Dad, it is finally over," Lisa said as they left the courthouse. "Margaret Simpson will never hurt another family." Jake nodded and looked back at the courthouse where his nightmare had finally ended. "Lisa, your grandfather always said that justice takes time, but it always comes." Margaret Simpson finally got what she deserved. Outside the courthouse, Patricia Williams announced that the state had recovered over $2 million for victims and would continue investigating similar fraud schemes. Margaret's conviction had sent a message that property fraud would not be tolerated. Margaret Simpson began serving her 15-year sentence at a federal prison facility, where she would have plenty of time to think about the families she had destroyed. Her criminal career was over, and her victims could finally begin rebuilding their lives. 6 months after Margaret Simpson's conviction, Jake Martinez stood on the dock of his lake cabin, watching the sunrise over the water. The peaceful morning was a far cry from the nightmare that had begun when he discovered Margaret living in his family's retreat. Jake had spent the past months renovating the cabin and removing all traces of Margaret's occupation. He had restored his grandfather's original decorations and returned the property to its natural beauty. The white plastic furniture and garden gnomes were gone forever. The cabin now served a special purpose that would have made his grandfather proud. Jake had converted it into a retreat center for veterans dealing with legal issues and property disputes. 3 times per month he hosted weekend workshops where veterans could get free legal advice and support. "Dad, the first group of veterans will arrive this afternoon," Lisa Martinez Chen said as she walked out onto the dock, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Lisa had taken a leave of absence from her regular prosecutor duties to help establish the retreat center. She had also been promoted within the federal prosecutor's office and now specialized in property rights cases inspired by her father's experience. "I think grandfather would approve of what we are doing here," Jake said as he accepted the coffee from his daughter. The retreat center had become well known throughout the veteran community, and Jake received thank you letters from families who had been helped by the legal workshops. Many of the attendees were dealing with fraudulent HOA schemes similar to what Margaret had attempted. State Attorney General Patricia Williams had used Margaret's case to push through new legislation protecting property owners from fraudulent HOA claims. The new laws required strict documentation and oversight of homeowner associations and created severe penalties for fraud. "Jake, your case changed everything," Patricia had told him at the bill signing ceremony. "No family will ever have to go through what you experienced." The legislation was known informally as the Martinez Property Protection Act and had been adopted by several other states dealing with similar fraud problems. Jake's name was now associated with a major victory for property rights across the country. Agent Carlos Rodriguez had also stayed in touch with Jake and often brought FBI trainees to the retreat center to learn about property fraud investigation. The case had become a textbook example of how federal agencies could work together to stop organized crime. "Mr. Martinez, your case is taught at the FBI Academy as an example of how one family's courage can expose an entire criminal network," Carlos had explained during his last visit. Margaret Simpson was serving her 15-year sentence at a federal prison facility and had become a model for how the justice system handles organized fraud. Her conviction had led to similar investigations in 12 other states, and dozens of other criminals had been arrested. Deputy Kevin Hayes had served 6 months in county jail and been permanently banned from law enforcement. He now worked at a hardware store and had written a letter of apology to Jake that was both sincere and heartbreaking. County Clerk Helen Murphy had received probation and community service, but lost her job and pension. She volunteered at the retreat center helping veterans navigate legal paperwork and had become one of Jake's most dedicated supporters. "I want to spend the rest of my life helping people instead of hurting them," Helen had told Jake when she first volunteered. The Real Sunset Lake HOA had publicly apologized for Margaret's actions and donated $10,000 to the retreat center. They had also implemented strict oversight procedures to prevent anyone from claiming false authority over non-member properties. Jake received hundreds of letters from families across the country who had been inspired by his story to fight back against fraudulent schemes. Many of the letters came from elderly people who had been too scared to resist until they heard about his victory. One particularly moving letter came from veteran Robert Davis, who had testified at Margaret's trial. Robert had recovered most of his stolen money through the Victim Compensation Fund and was rebuilding his family farm. "Mr. Martinez, you showed me that we do not have to accept being victims," Robert wrote. "Your courage gave me the strength to fight for my family's land." Lisa had also received recognition for her role in exposing the corruption network. She had been featured in legal magazines and invited to speak at conferences about combating organized fraud. Her career had been transformed by the case that started with her father's phone call from jail. "Dad, sometimes I think Margaret Simpson did us a favor by picking our family," Lisa said as they finished their coffee on the dock. Jake laughed and shook his head. "I would not go that far, but we certainly turned her scheme against her." The retreat center had also attracted attention from the White House, and Jake had received a personal letter from the president thanking him for exposing the corruption and protecting the rights of American property owners. "Mr. Martinez, your courage in defending your family's land represents the best of American values," the president had written. "You have made our country stronger by refusing to accept injustice." Jake kept the president's letter framed in the main room of the retreat center, where visiting veterans could see it. Many of them were inspired by the recognition that their own property struggles were part of a larger fight for American values. As the afternoon approached, Jake prepared to welcome the latest group of veterans to the retreat center. Each workshop brought new stories of families fighting against fraudulent schemes and corrupt officials. "Lisa, I never thought that defending my grandfather's cabin would turn into a national movement," Jake said as he watched cars beginning to arrive for the workshop. "Dad, grandfather always said that the Martinez family stands up to bullies," Lisa replied. "You just happened to stand up to the right bully at the right time." Jake walked back toward the cabin to greet the arriving veterans. Each of them was dealing with legal challenges similar to what he had faced with Margaret Simpson. The retreat center gave them hope and practical help in fighting back. Margaret Simpson had thought she was targeting a helpless old man living alone at a remote lake cabin. Instead, she had exposed her entire criminal network and inspired a national movement to protect property rights. Jake Martinez had not only defended his family's land, but had helped protect thousands of other families from similar fraud. His grandfather's cabin had become a symbol of American determination to fight corruption and defend individual rights. As Jake welcomed the first veteran family to the retreat center, he thought about how his quiet retirement had been transformed into something much more meaningful. Margaret Simpson had given him a purpose he never expected to find. The lake was peaceful again, but Jake's fight for justice would continue for as long as families needed help defending their homes and property. His grandfather's legacy lived on in every family that refused to accept being victimized by criminals like Margaret Simpson.